of the National Capital Area Skeptics. I'm Scott Snell, the current president, live streaming from the Washington, D.C. area. We've been hosting these monthly events free and open to the public since our founding in 1987. Now, some of you hearing the word skeptics in our name may be thinking, oh, great, closed-minded people. But no, we strive to be open-minded. We skeptics promote scientific understanding and critical thinking. Before we begin our program, I want to make a quick shout out to our skeptical neighbors, the West Virginia Skeptics Society. Through their efforts, the governor of West Virginia has proclaimed this upcoming Saturday, February 15th, as Critical Thinking Awareness Day. I invite you to visit criticalthinkingday.com, that's their website, to learn more about this. They've posted some suggested activities to celebrate Critical Thinking Awareness Day. If I may, I'll add a suggestion, especially if Saturday's weather is unpleasant, as it's forecast to be here. Stay home and read an excellent skeptical book. I'll suggest this classic by astronomer Carl Sagan, Demon Haunted World. Great examples, critical thinking, compassionate evaluation of some pretty charged questions, evidence-based claims. It's a really beautiful book, still relevant, perhaps most relevant in our time after 30 years when this came out. And I'll share with you what I'm going to read this weekend, which is another critical thinking book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. So this came out about 50 years ago, and you couldn't top the Bermuda Triangle as far as like getting a lot of TV and news media coverage, and it was all BS, pretty much. I mean, there are unsolved mysteries, but there's no evidence that something extraordinary happened out there. And this research librarian, the author, Larry Kusch, at Arizona State University, just did a great job of not repeating the previous authors, but researching himself to primary sources, Lloyd's of London Insurance and news media of that time and so on. So anyway, a tremendous example of critical thinking. And I did call that out for him in particular because I've recently learned he passed away last year. And that book was sort of my gateway into this skeptical movement where we promote critical thinking and the scientific method. And when it comes to, say, medical research, we certainly want science to light the way. Same with law enforcement in the criminal justice system. We don't want a guilty person to go free, possibly to harm others. And we don't want an innocent person to be incarcerated or executed if the scientific method wasn't properly applied in terms of crime scene investigation. Our speaker tonight will discuss questions in particular about the field of fingerprint science. She's Dr. Heidi Eldridge, Assistant Professor of Forensic Science and Director of Graduate Studies and Crime Scene Investigations at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She spent approximately 11 years working in state, local, and regional forensic laboratories where she performed casework in controlled substances, latent prints, and crime scene analysis and reconstruction. She's current chair of the Friction Ridge Consensus Body of the American Standards Board and of the Forensic Science Education Programs Accreditation Commission. She sits on the boards of directors of both the International Association for Identification, the American Standards Board, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Dr. Eldridge sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Forensic Identification and is a certified latent print examiner with the International Association for Identification. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us from the Washington, D.C. area, Dr. Heidi Eldridge.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you all about fingerprint science. We're going to look into some of the things you might want to be skeptical about, some of the premises that the public often takes for granted that may not be quite what you expect to hear. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get my screen sharing working here so you can all follow along with my slides. And I think that did it. Everybody should be seeing my title slide right now. So great, thank you. So what we're going to talk about here, I've titled this talk, How Much is Enough and How Sure Are You? Because these are sort of the big questions that we're often being asked in court today. These are things that we're expected to have good answers to, and I don't know that we necessarily do have good answers to them. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of where we are on that and recent research that we have done to try to establish a good foundation for fingerprint comparison decisions. I'll just start off by saying that the reason I say we need to establish a good foundation for fingerprint comparison decisions is because historically there really isn't much of one. We've been using fingerprints in the court system for more than 100 years, but it grew up as a police science. It grew up with police officers telling other police officers, hey, this seems to work pretty well. And they went ahead and started using it. But they hadn't done a lot of the sort of scientifically rigorous testing and validation that most sciences go through to demonstrate that they can be used effectively and reliably. So that left us with sort of a gap where we have this court history where everyone assumes that fingerprints are reliable, but we never really did the work to build that foundation. So here we are now in 2025, and we're still trying to go back and shore up that foundation. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I made a slide to give you some background on me, but Scott did such a good job of introducing me. I'm not sure we need that. I'll just breeze through this really quickly. I do oddly have my undergraduate degree in speech and theater, nothing scientific at all. But then I have a master's degree in biology from Duke and a PhD in forensic science from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. So I've been sort of all over the place there. I did start out in Oregon with the state police. I spent 3 years there doing controlled substance work and training in latent fingerprints, which is what I ended up falling in love with and sticking to. So then I moved to Eugene Police Department, which was a small city agency, and I was there for almost 6 years, doing both latent prints and crime scenes. Then I went to Las Vegas Metro, which is what the CSI TV show is based on. And I worked there for about 3 years doing just latent prints. Then I moved to RTI International. Oops, I have a typo there. That should be 2015 to 2022. And that was in North Carolina. It is a scientific research institution. So there I was a full-time researcher for about 7 years, looking at foundational issues to do with fingerprints mostly. And then I came to George Washington 3 years ago, and I've been a professor there ever since. As was already mentioned, I'm teaching crime scenes and fingerprint classes. So I've done quite a bit of research looking at things like how we determine our decision thresholds in fingerprints and how accurate people are when they make fingerprint decisions and human factors in fingerprints, things that affect our decision making. And I'm also a member of a number of national and international standard setting committees and professional organizations. So even though I'm not working in the police agencies anymore, I'm still very plugged in with the community and talking to practitioners all the time. All right, so let's jump into content here. Starting with the question of how much is enough. I'm going to talk about three concepts, which are suitability, sufficiency, and examiner variability. And these are all getting at this notion of how much information do we need to support a decision. If I say this fingerprint is good enough to compare, well, what makes it good enough? If I say that these two impressions are similar enough that I can say that they were made by one individual, well, how do I know? How do I know I have enough and that somebody else couldn't have just as much information in common? And because we don't necessarily have great definitions of those things, we do see examiner variability. We see differences of opinions when looking at the same stimulus or the same evidence. So we're going to talk through that a little bit. All right, so we'll start off with the common public conception. Latent print examiners are often perceived as infallible. And this is not really an accident. We're kind of trained to appear infallible. We're sort of taught how to have the right demeanor in court and how to dress and how to speak so that we look really, really trustworthy. And we're sort of taught the phrases to say that make it sound like we couldn't possibly have made a mistake. And for a long time, we used these phrases continually. We would say things in court like, well, the method, when applied correctly, has a zero error rate, which is just kind of patently a stupid thing to claim, right? Nothing that humans are involved in has a zero error rate. There's always a chance that we can make a mistake. But we would sit there with a straight face and say that, and people believed us. They would ask us how certain we were of our conclusion, and we'd say, well, I'm 100% certain. Really? We'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. We'll get into certainty. But it's another one of those things that, as a scientist, hearing somebody say that they're 100% certain of a scientific decision should make you twitch. Like nobody should be comfortable hearing that. Okay, and we do know, even though we give out this aura that we are infallible, we do have errors and we do have disagreements. This does occur. And usually, this is where the human factors stuff comes in. Usually, those differences of opinion have to do with differences in perception. We're seeing and interpreting visual information differently from one another, or at times differently than ourselves at a different viewing. So there's a lot of interpretation that goes on between the eye and the brain before you can reach a decision. And we don't always follow the same pathway every time you do that. So at the end of the day, we are interpreting visual data. And of course, that visual data also is not always pristine. Sometimes we have very clear, very beautiful impressions, and sometimes we have very fragmentary, very smudged impressions. But we're still trying to make decisions on either one. So you can see where that could become problematic. All right, so it turns out that these errors and disagreements that occur are more likely to occur when the data are ambiguous. This should be very much like me telling you that water is wet. When something is very clear, we tend to agree about it. But when it's a little bit murky, when there's more interpretation involved, that's where we tend to have disagreements, and that's where the errors tend to happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about sufficiency, this notion of how much information do we need to be confident in our decisions. So, sufficiency can be summarized as how much is enough from the title of the talk. And we invoke this notion of how much is enough at several times during our process. So, when we're comparing fingerprints, we do it by proceeding through a number of phases. And the first phase is known as analysis. And this is when we look at an unknown latent print that was taken from a crime scene. And we sort of determine, is there enough here to even do anything with it? Because we could look at it and say, you know what, this is so degraded. There's so little reliable information. I'm not even going to compare this because there's not enough information here to guide me in any way that's useful. Or we could look at it and say, you know what, it is clear enough. Maybe there's some problems, but I can dig out enough information I trust that I feel comfortable taking this on to comparison. So at that very first gateway, we're already making a suitability decision. We're deciding if there's enough information here. Then we move on to the comparison phase, which is where we take that unknown impression from the crime scene and we put it next to a known impression from some individual. Could be a suspect, could be a victim, could be a police officer who wasn't wearing gloves. It could be a person who had legitimate access to the scene. But anyway, we're doing this side-by-side comparison and we're trying to see, do we find features in agreement? Do we find features in disagreement? And again, this notion of how much is enough. Do we have enough in agreement to conclude that these two impressions were made by the same source or the same finger or palm or whatever it is that we're looking at? While we're making these decisions at both analysis and comparison, we're thinking about things like the quantity. How much information is here? The rarity of that information. How often is it likely that these features are repeated in the population? Because it could be that I see features in common, but almost everybody has those features, in which case they're not very useful for distinguishing between people. Or we also consider the reliability of those features. Are they clear enough that I believe that what I'm seeing is accurate? Or am I interpreting so much? Am I so far into the weeds that I'm almost making up a fairy tale for myself? Right? We want to make sure that what we're looking at is able to be relied upon. So those are the things we're considering when we talk about sufficiency at these different levels. And the question becomes, how do we determine it? What tools can we use to make a judgment call? Because for a long time, we didn't really have tools. It was just everybody would make a call for themselves. We would go by our sort of gut feeling. well, I've looked at a lot of fingerprints in my day, and this one is better than what most of the ones that I see, so I'm going to go ahead and trust it. But there were no sort of numbers or metrics or even quality assessments behind that. It was just each person's opinion. So we've been trying to find ways to standardize that a bit and make it a little more objective. So this is one of our early attempts. This is what was known as a sufficiency graph, put out by an organization called SWIGFAST. And SWIGFAST is an acronym that stands for the Scientific Working Group for Friction Ridge Analysis, Study, and Technology. And this is a group that was funded by the FBI back in the day. And it was essentially 20 sort of hand-picked fingerprint experts who were the top of their field, who would get together a couple times a year and they would come up with guidelines and recommendations and standards for the community to follow in how to best do the practice of latent print comparison. So they came up with this chart that they called the sufficiency graph. And essentially what it did was on the x-axis here, we have the number of minutiae that we're seeing, and minutiae are just the features within a fingerprint. If you see a ridge ending or splitting in two, that's something where the path is doing something more interesting than just flowing along indefinitely. We call those minutiae, and those are things that are very highly distinctive between people. So if you find many minutiae in common between two impressions, that increases the probability that they came from the same person. So along the x-axis, we're looking at how many of those minutiae we were able to find. And then along the y-axis, we're looking at the quality of the impression itself. Is it very clear? Can we trust the information that's in it? And then they have this little quality chart off to the side here that helps to define those different levels of quality. So you can see that these are still reasonably squishy terms. This is still pretty subjective. We're saying things like level one is distinct. Well, what makes it distinct, right? How clear does it have to be distinct? That's still going to be an individual judgment call. But at least they're putting some sort of a framework here to guide us into how much information we want. So I prepared a couple little examples here just to give you an idea of how this would be put into practice. So here's one. This is a fingerprint on the right here that I'll tell you right now is fairly clear. It may look upsetting to some of you because as you look at these for a long time, your eye-brain path sort of develops where we're able to discern what's going on in some of these sort of uglier areas a little bit, and we get an experiential range of what good versus bad looks like. But this is a pretty clear print, especially in this middle section here. We have a lot of nice stuff going on. So if I were to try to position this one onto this sufficiency graph, I would look at the number of minutiae I found and the overall clarity and the overall rarity to make my judgment. So what I've done here, this is just my personal judgment. And again, different examiners may find different features. That's that examiner variability we were talking about, because we all have different visual grayscale acuity, where some of us are better than others at interpreting the differences between, shades of gray to tease out these features in these sort of harder to see areas. So when I just went through here and did this for the example, I came up with 13 green dots on here. And each of these dots is basically marking a place where I think there's a minutia. So for instance, up here, you can see that there's one ridge here and there's two ridges right here. That's because this ridge split where the green dot is. So we call that a bifurcation. We have ridge endings in here, like this green dot right here. This is where this ridge was coming along and then it just stopped. So that gets a dot as a minutia. So I go through and I mark all the ones in green that I'm really confident about, the ones that I'm sure are there, and that if I saw them in another impression, I would expect to recognize them. Then I have a few here that are in yellow, and these are the ones that I'm not as confident about. I think there's something going on there, but I can't see it as well. And you'll notice that they're in the less clear areas of the print. So I'm using a little more interpretation there to discern whether that's a feature. I could even put red dots on here. So it's sort of like a traffic light, green, yellow, red. And the red ones would mean like, there could be something there, but I'm really not betting the bank on it. So when I do that and I count them all up, I come up with 13 green and 4 yellow minutia, which means that I'm looking at somewhere between 13 and 17 on this x-axis. So I'd be somewhere in this range along the x-axis. But then looking on the y-axis, I want to think about the quality of what I'm seeing. And so I'm looking at different levels of detail, and I'm not going to go too much into those levels right now because that's getting a bit in the weeds for this group. But basically, I'm seeing that at the three levels of detail, I can see distinct, clear information that I trust. So that's going to put me up here in like a medium high to high category on the quality side. And so when I get the intersection of those two, I end up around in this area where the purple dot is. And what that basically means is I'm in this green zone, which means most examiners would be comfortable with this print. We would mostly consider that this is sufficient, that there's enough information here that we could use it to rely upon for a decision. So we're going to go ahead and carry forward and do our comparison.
Quick question. I
Yeah.
see A, B, and C, and then
Yes.
I also see level one, two, and three. Those are completely independent of each other.
Yeah.
Is that
They're
correct?
complete, yes, they're completely different. So A, B, and C here are just the zones on this graph. So C is this green zone where we're really happy. B is sort of a danger zone-ish. These are prints that we would call complex, which
Mhm.
means we would still compare them, but we'd be more cautious. We'd be doing more documentation. We might be doing more reviews and other quality assurance procedures. And then A, these are the ones that probably you shouldn't be comparing unless you have a really good reason, because
Mhm.
there's just not that much reliable information. The levels are features of the fingerprint itself. So level one detail is actually talking about the shape of the fingerprint. So looking at the way these ridges flow, these ones happen to be in a pattern that's known as a loop, where it comes in on one side, loops around, and goes back out on the same side. So that's what we mean when we say level one is can we see that ridge flow clearly?
Okay,
And
thank
then level two is these little dots that I've marked. All these individual features are part of level two detail. So it just has to do with how fine the details that you can see clearly.
Heidi, just so
Yeah.
you know,
Yep.
where you are seeing your mouse on your screen is not where we're seeing it on the slide for some reason. It's far to the left.
Oh,
So you
okay.
won't be able to rely on where the mouse is pointing to describe where things are.
Thank you. I wonder if, yeah, I don't know if I can get a laser that will, oh wait, laser pointer. Okay. Am I pointing to the purple dot right now? Okay. And
Yes, you are.
am I pointing to the green dots?
Yes, you are.
All
Perfect.
right. Now we're cooking with gas. Thank you.
you.
Okay. Okay, so here's another example. I'll just walk you through this one. Similarly, we've got the print over here on the right, and we're looking at features. How many features can we find? So you can see that I've marked the good ones in green. I've marked the yellow ones as the ones that I'm not quite as confident about. And I'm pointing the right place. That's great. Um, so if I count up really the main minutia points that I see, I would only get 4 green and 4 yellow, which is not awesome. That's sort of borderline as to whether I would consider that enough. Looking at these levels of detail, remember level one is that overall flow. Well, I can see the way the ridges are flowing up here, but I can't so much down here, right? This area is kind of obscured by all of this distortion and degradation. If I get to the level two, where I'm looking at the specific features, I can see some, but they're not great. But I have lots of level three. Level three is little tiny, tiny details, which is all these little dots up here. The thing is, those aren't worth that much because they don't always record reliably. So looking at what I have just right now, I'm down here in the red zone because I don't have very many minutia and I don't have great clarity or quality. But I do have some rarity here. I do have some features that are less common. And so that's actually going to push me up. I'm going to adjust my purple dot over here because I'm giving myself sort of bonus points for the unusualness of the features that I see. So again, you can see that this is a more objective framework, but still kind of subjective. I'm still going a little bit with my gut of, well, I feel like that should get some extra oomph. So that was that old swig fast. And this was probably 20 years ago that this was sort of in vogue. So I'm going to show you some more recent research that has tried to move us forward. And this is just talking a bit about some of the errors that we've known. You know, we know that errors do occur. This is a well-known one out of Scotland, known as the McKee error. And this was a police officer who was accused of having gone into a crime scene where a murder occurred And she swore that she had never been there. It wasn't that she was accused of doing the crime. It was more that she was accused of breaking protocol because she wasn't supposed to be in the crime scene. And they were saying, well, you were just so curious and nosy, you couldn't help going in or whatever. And she swore up and down that she'd never been there. Well, over here, this is the print that was found at the crime scene. This is Shirley McKee's print, and the Scottish examiners believed that they had identified those to one another. And then the international community got involved, and a whole bunch of people reviewed this comparison, and the common consensus was that this was not a correct identification, that the Scottish police had misidentified Shirley McKee. To this day, they still maintain that they were right. But it was a huge sort of international debate. Another one that we have that was closer to home, this was in the United States in 2004. This is the Mayfield error, which is our most famous fingerprint error. This was made by the FBI. And this was an error that was in relation to the Madrid train bombing that happened in 2004. In that case, hundreds of people were killed, hundreds more injured. It was a packed commuter train in Madrid, and a bomb went off. And they found a plastic bag full of detonator caps in a van not far from the train. And so Interpol sent that fingerprint out to law enforcement agencies all over the world trying to identify the person who was responsible for this bombing. And the FBI came up with this guy here, Brandon Mayfield, who was a lawyer working in Portland, Oregon at the time. He was American, but he was married to a Muslim woman, and he had converted to Islam because of that. And so they immediately decided that he must be a terrorist. After some time, the Spanish National Police came up with this guy, Onane Daoud, and said, no, actually, he's the one who matches the fingerprint. And he was a known Algerian terrorist living in Spain at the time, where Brandon Mayfield had never even been to Spain. So they ended up having a sort of battle of the experts. The FBI went over to Spain to show them how very wrong they were, and came home with their tail firmly tucked between their legs, saying, okay, actually, Spain was right. Well, this is the print in question in the middle here. This is what they was found on that bag of detonator caps. And I know none of you guys are fingerprint examiners, so it may be difficult for you to discern this, but if you look at the Mayfield print and you look at the Daoud print, they're actually quite different. There are a lot of differences between the two. So you would never mix up Mayfield and Daoud if you had clear, pristine prints like these. But if you look at this piece of garbage in the middle that was the crime scene print, you can see how they easily made that mistake because there is such a high degree of interpretation happening in this middle image that you could convince yourself that it looked like either one of these. And that's exactly what happened. 3 examiners at the FBI all agreed that this belonged to Mayfield before they were presented with Daoud as an option. All right. So we know from these cases and others like them that analysts are actually variable. There are differences between examiners, which we call inter-examiner variability. There are differences with the same examiner seeing things at different times, which is called intra-examiner variability. And it permeates every step of the process. So when we're choosing what features we're going to rely upon, there's variability there. When we're determining what kind of distortion we see and how important it is, there's variability there. When we decide whether a print is good enough to use or not, there's variability there. So I'm going to start for just a minute talking about the variability in analysis, which is that first step where we decide whether we're going to compare or not. And so we look at a print like this, an unknown print from a crime scene, and we select the features we're going to use, and we assign weight to those features. And we do that using this color system I was mentioning, where the green are the ones we're confident in, the yellow ones we're less confident, and the red, not very much at all. And we decide whether or not we're going to compare the latent. Now, I've told you that there's variability between examiners, but some people say, who cares? What difference does it make? If you get to the same decision at the end of the day, what difference does it make what path you took to get there? If you're driving to the store, you can take a right on one block or a left on the other block, but as long as you end up at the store, does it matter which road you took? It turns out it really kind of does matter. So the thing is that if we're looking at these impressions and we're choosing features differently, we may end up with usable latents that don't get compared, things that come from a crime scene that could have been compared, but because one examiner didn't think it was good enough, they never looked at it. And that could have been the print that made a difference in a case. We might have unreliable prints that should not be compared, that an examiner decides to compare. And those are the ones that may lead to errors because there's so much interpretation going on. There could be unreliable features that a particular examiner relies upon that they should not have relied upon. And at the end of the day, the real problem is that this process is largely opaque. A lot of it's going on inside the head of the examiner, and we don't necessarily know what they were looking at, how they were weighing it, or what was supporting their decisions. So we have some research that has illustrated this pretty starkly, I think. This was an article that came out in 2013 done by Henry Swafford and a team of researchers, where they took a really simple question and they just said, you know what? We're going to give some really clear images to fingerprint experts, and we're simply going to ask them, how many features do you see? And that should be a very easy question. You just look in here, like here's a feature, here's a feature, here's a feature, you count them up and you give a number. Well, these are the three images from that study that had the lowest standard deviation, which means there was the lowest spread of data or the most agreement between examiners. And you can see these are pretty low standard deviations, 0.26, 0.33, 0.40. Those aren't terrible. It means there wasn't a whole lot of spread in the data, but they weren't zero. The fact is that with the clearest, easiest prints he could possibly give to trained experts, they still didn't entirely agree on how many features were even present in those images. These images are from the same study. This was the other end of the spectrum. So these were the worst images that he gave to the examiners. And you can see the standard deviations here are quite a bit larger. We've got 3.75, 3.25, 2.25. That represents a much greater spread of data. And you can see why they had a little bit more trouble. We have things like wrinkles going through here and here. And there becomes a question of, well, how do we define a feature? If I know that this ridge is meant to go through and it's just being broken up by a wrinkle, do I count that as no features? Or do I count it as two because the ridge stops here and it picks up again here? So because we don't have clear definitions of what constitutes a feature, people are putting their own interpretation on it and we're coming up with different responses. This is another research project that was done by Glenn Langenberg, who's a well-known researcher in the fingerprint field. And what he did was he took a bunch of examiners as well, and he showed them different prints. These are some examples of some of the prints he showed them. And similarly, he asked them to just count how many features do you see in this image? And he showed them to 144 experts. And then he also showed them to some novices, some college students who didn't have fingerprint training to see if there was a difference. And so he said, just mark the ones that you're highly confident in, and then tell me whether you consider this print to be of value or not. In other words, would you compare this print? Do you think it's good enough to compare? All right, and then, oops, hold on. These are the data that he got. So across the top here, we have these 10 fingerprints that he showed them. The blue box plots are from the expert data, the green are from the novice data. And what we see here is that, first of all, for each pair, the blue box plots are generally higher, which means that experts were able to find more features than novices were, which we would expect. I mentioned earlier that that eye-brain system gets trained as you go through your fingerprint training and you're able to discern more features. But the interesting thing here is the spread, even for the experts. So when you're looking at a box plot or a box and whiskers plot like these are, the middle colored box, I'll use the green one because it's a little easier to see. The middle colored box is the middle 50% of your data, and the black line is the median. And then the whiskers here are the next 25% of data in each direction, with outliers being represented by these little dots here. So what we see, if we look even at the blue ones, which are the experts, you can see that the range of the number of minutia here is running from what, about 8 up to 23 or so. This one's running from about 6 up to 45, maybe. And that's experts looking at the same impression and saying how many features they found. And that's an enormous range for experts to not be sure if there's 6 or 45 features in the same impression. So that's a little concerning. This is from the same study. The same 10 prints here. This one is looking at from asking just the experts, did they consider the print to be good enough to compare or not? So green means yes, I would compare it. Red means no, I wouldn't. And again, we're just looking at the shape of the data here. We're just looking at the variability. And you see that not one of these 10 prints had a unanimous decision. In every single one of them, some number of people thought that it was good enough to compare, and some number thought it was not good enough to compare. And in some cases, like LP7 here, it's almost even. About half the people went each direction. This is a later study by the same fellow, Glenn Langenberg. And in this one, he again asked experts what features they saw, but this time, instead of asking for a number, he asked them to actually mark the specific features that they saw. And this is a really compelling example here because this is the same impression that's been marked by two different experts, and each expert marked 11 minutiae. So if they only told you the number, you would say, oh, well, they're in complete agreement. They both found 11 minutiae or 11 features. But if you look at which features they marked, this guy marked one over here that this one didn't mark. This guy marked 2 here. This guy marked 4 in the same area. So they weren't marking the same features. It turns out that out of those 11 features, only 6 were ones that they both marked. So they actually had 10 between them that were different that they marked. This is part of some research that I did a few years back. This is the citation in the box down here. And this was looking at something known as connective ambiguity. And what that means is I talked about the type of features we rely upon being either ridge endings, where the ridge stops, or bifurcations where it splits in two. The thing is, we can't always tell the difference. If there's a lack of clarity in the image, like over in this area here, it can be really hard to know if it touched or not. All you know is that something happened, but you may not know which something happened. And this is an example of that where this pink dot is. This is actually a fairly clear area of this impression, but when I asked a bunch of experts what features they saw, 10 of them said, oh, that's definitely a ridge ending. 14 of them said, oh, it's definitely a bifurcation. One said, there's something there, but I can't tell what it is. And nobody said that they weren't sure if there was anything at all. So everybody was sure something was happening here, but they were almost 50-50 split on what kind of something was happening there. So it kind of suggests that it doesn't actually matter that much whether it's a ridge ending or a bifurcation because examiners are not treating them differently. They're not accurately distinguishing between them. And it turns out we don't even know what the real truth is here because this is just an impression. This is just basically a stamp made from somebody's finger, right? The real truth is on the skin. We would have to look at the skin to see whether those two ridges actually connect or if one just ends next to another one. But we don't have the skin when we're doing crime scene work. We only have these impressions. So we're always doing some amount of interpretation, even in relatively clear areas like this one. Okay, this is another study that was done on examiner reliability and accuracy. This is kind of the study. This is our gold standard study in the field. It was done by a team led by Ullery, and it was a joint endeavor between the FBI and a research firm known as Noblis, which is actually located in Virginia. And so the FBI and Noblis did a series of papers. These are the first two. This top title here is from 2011. The second title is from 2012. And they basically gave a bunch of fingerprints to examiners, asked them if they were suitable to compare or not, and then had them compare them and see how accurate they were. And what they found was 43% of the marks were unanimously agreed to be of value, to be suitable to compare. But that means that the rest of them were not unanimously decided. And then they also had 147 impressions that they gave twice to the same examiner without them knowing it. Each examiner looked at 100 impressions, so you would definitely forget what you had seen earlier by the time you got to the later ones. So without the examiners being aware, they showed them the same impression twice for 900 presentations. And those examiners who saw the same impression twice actually changed their mind 8% of the time about whether it was able to be compared or not. This is another part of that same study. This is the follow-up study a year later, where they had a bunch of the people who had taken part in the first study. They had them come along for a follow-up study where they gave them 25 of the same prints from the first study and just repeated the same thing to see if they would agree with themselves. This was several months later. And again, they had 1% of the value decisions were completely reversed from saying, absolutely, I would compare it to anything, to no, it's not worth comparing at all. And this is from the same series. This is just looking at some specific fingerprint examples here where they asked different examiners whether they thought it was a value or not. And in this one, 100% of people agreed that they would compare it, but they only asked 5 examiners. In this one, only 57% of people said they would examine it. 29% said they wouldn't. That was among 7 examiners. And so on. I want to get through other things, so I'm not going to linger on this too long. But they repeated that experiment with a much larger sample where they had over 3,500 latents analyzed or impressions analyzed. And again, just look at the variability. That's the main take-home message I want you guys to get. So out of all the people who looked at these impressions, here's how many minutia they caught. And then this is how many of them said, yes, they would compare it. So blue means, yes, I would compare it. Black means, no, I wouldn't. And again, you can just see that there's a lot of overlap in these decisions until you get up above like 30 features. Then everyone says, yeah, I'd compare it. But down here, we have one where there were 0 features, and yet there's a little sliver of blue up there, meaning someone said, yeah, I'll compare it, even though it has no features. Looking at these reds out here, these are ones that people would use to exclude, but they wouldn't use to identify. It had 25 features, and some people were like, nah, I don't think it's good enough. So we really need to have some clearer definitions of how much is enough, what is required to support these decisions. This is yet another study. I'm putting all the citations up here in case you guys want to look into these. This is just one print out of the study. I think they had 12 prints in this study. So this is a picture of the print. These are the decisions that were rendered about that print. So these are the people who said, yeah, I'd compare it to anything. These are the people who said, well, I could use it to exclude someone, but not to ID them. And these are the people who said, no, you couldn't do anything with this. You couldn't even compare it. Similar things come when we ask them questions about distortion. In this study, they were asking people, is this print distorted? And if so, what kind of distortion factors do you see? So that's the print they looked at. And these are all the different distortion factors they were offered and how many people said them. So again, you can see that there's a lot of disagreement about what type of distortion people saw. But distortion is one of the things we rely upon when we're making decisions. So we would like that to be much more consistent. This is part of the work I did for my PhD. I was looking at these analysis decisions as well. So in my study, I had 100 impressions that I took out of casework. So they were sort of ecologically valid. Each of my participants got 30 impressions to look at. So each image was looked at by between 26 and 41 expert examiners for over 3,000 analyses. And we found the same kind of thing, lack of agreement. When we had something really pretty like this, where it was large and there was lots of information, it's very clear. Okay, people were unanimous on that. They all agreed they could use that. But the agreement fell off super quickly. This is not much worse than the one before, but in this one, 35 people said they'd use it and 1 wasn't sure. Here we get a little bit worse. 28 people said they'd use it. 1 person said that they could use it to generate an investigative lead, but not to make a final determination. This one, which is really ugly, the voting is almost even across the board. Every possibility I gave them as how likely are you to use this for a comparison, I got votes for every possibility. And we never had consensus at the bad end of the scale. Never, this is a pretty bad print here. 21 people here said this is not a value, I would not compare it. But people voted the other things, and 5 people said, yeah, I love it, I'd compare it to anything. This thing where you can hardly see anything at all. Okay, so that wasn't working. So we tried to come up with new tools that we could use to try to narrow this variability. This is a study that I did in conjunction with the FBI, where we tried to come up with what we called plus factors and minus factors, which just means things you notice within the print that make you more likely to want to compare it or less likely. And we made this little app online where they could check off the factors they saw. This is just a list of some of the minus factors they could choose. And they were just things like seeing a lot of features or seeing distortion or seeing color transitions between the ridges or seeing damage from a brush, that sort of thing. And then we would score them based on what they had chosen, and we would put them into bins. And you don't need to read all of this, but basically we had no value, meaning I wouldn't compare it. And this MCQ stands for manual comparison quality. So it just means is it high, medium, or low comparison quality? And we had sort of definitions for that were really based on how much you would expect another examiner to agree or disagree with you. Based on the reliability of the information. And using this tool, we actually managed to train people to about 80% consensus, meaning if they use the criteria we laid out, about 80% of the time that they would agree, they would put the prints into the same bin, which of course still means 20% of the time they're not agreeing. But we started out below that before we were giving them these guidelines. So it was helping to tighten up that variability. Okay, so that's that analysis piece. That's just the deciding if I'm going to compare it. Now that I know I want to compare it, I move into this comparison stage. In the comparison stage, I'm looking at two prints side by side. So I have my crime scene print that I already marked with the minutia I found. And then I've now got this exemplar that comes from a known individual. And I want to find out, did they come from the same source or not? So I'm looking for similarities and I'm looking for differences, and I'm going to reach a conclusion. And traditionally, the three conclusions I'd be allowed to use would be identification, meaning, yes, I believe they came from the same person, or exclusion, meaning, no, they couldn't have come from the same person, or inconclusive, meaning, I just really can't tell. We're starting to introduce new language now, which I'm not going to go too deep into right now, but we are trying to introduce some categories that are sort of like leaning towards identification or leaning towards exclusion for those times when you have some data to support one of those two, but it's not enough data for you to say, this is my strongest conclusion in this direction. You're just saying, well, I see some stuff that tends to support it. It would be sort of like analogous to saying, I know that my perpetrator had blonde hair. Well, okay, if I find a blonde hair at the crime scene, then that certainly supports that the suspect could be my perpetrator, but he's certainly not the only person running around with blonde hair, right? So although it supports it, it's not enough. So that's what those leaning categories are for. All right, so we're back with this same paper I talked about earlier, the one with FBI and Nobles working together. These are the results just from the comparison phase. And what they found was with over 17,000 decisions made, they ended up with 6 false positive errors. In other words, 6 times when somebody said that 2 impressions were made by the same source, when in fact they were actually made by different people. So that translated to a 0.1% false positive rate, which is actually fairly encouraging. I mean, we don't want any mistakes, but humans make mistakes, and that's a pretty low number. We're much worse at the false negative errors, meaning that the prints actually came from the same person, and the examiner said, no, they came from different people. That happened 7.5% of the time, and it happened to 85% of the examiners who participated in the study, made at least one of those false exclusion errors. So they did the follow-up study, like I mentioned before. A few months later, they asked some people to relook at the same cases to see how consistent they would be. And they found that about 90% of both the identification and exclusion decisions were repeated, which means that about 10% of them were not, meaning people flipped on their original decision. And we've seen similar trends in another black box study that was done looking specifically at palm impressions. That was one that I conducted. And you can see the data here. In this one, we had 12 false positive errors and 500 false negative errors, which worked out to a false positive rate of a little over 0.5% and a false negative rate of about 9.5%. So these are just some images to give you an idea of the quality of the stuff that people were looking at. So this is one of our trials where everybody correctly excluded this print. This was a print that we presented with a non-mated pair, meaning they did not come from the same source, and everybody realized that. But you can see this is a pretty nice print. It's not super complete. Obviously, it's not the whole palm, but the area we have is very clear. There's a lot of detail here. There's plenty of information to support a decision. This was one that everyone correctly identified. So over here on the left, we have the unknown image, and on the right, we have the exemplar from a known individual. And again, it's a little hard to see the difference between the ridges in the background here because this is duct tape and it's gray. But if you zoom in on that and have your glasses on if you need them or whatever, there's actually quite a bit of information available in there that you can find over here to know that these came from the same source. This one had mixed responses. So over here we have the unknown. On the right, we have the known. And again, we don't have great contrast between the ridges and the background here. And we don't have a very large area of clarity. Really, this area is fairly clear and everything else is really difficult to see. So we ended up, this is one where the ground truth was that they were from the same source. So 37 people correctly made that determination. 4 people falsely said that they're from different sources. 30 people said, I'm not even going to compare that. It's not suitable to compare. And 15 people couldn't reach a conclusion. This is another one that was mixed. I'll go ahead and skip that one just because I want to get through some other stuff here. This one was the worst one in our study. This one was really concerning. Again, on the left, we have the unknown impression. On the right, we have the known. The ground truth here is that these were made by the same individual. These are same source. But if you look at the results, 29 people falsely said they came from different people. 28 people couldn't decide, and 28 people correctly identified it. That's an even split between all of their choices. So for this one, yeah, 28 people got it right, but there was no kind of consensus at all for this impression, and that's very concerning. All right. Exclusion errors are the more common type of error. It's harder to know if you haven't found something than to know if you have, because if you have found it, it's right in front of you and you're looking at it. But if you haven't found it, you don't know if you just failed to find it or if it's truly not there. So this is an example from the same study. This is the unknown that we gave them to compare. And they did their analysis and marked out all the features that they saw, which they did a good job with that. And this is the exemplar we gave them to compare it to. And you can see from the markings down at the bottom that this is where they thought it was. They were trying to match it up here. They thought the shape looked the same, and they were really focusing all their energy down here. They couldn't find these features here, and so they declared it to be an exclusion. They said these could not have been made by the same person. Ground truth, they were made by the same person, but it was up here. This is where it came from. So you can see why the exclusion errors are so much easier to make because you have all of this space to look at. You don't know which way this thing should be oriented. And if you get yourself locked into what we call a mindset, where you're convinced that this has to be from this area or nowhere, then if you don't find it, you just say, well, then it doesn't go here, when in fact it does. They just were looking in the wrong place. Here's yet another one. I told you guys I'd have lots and lots of data. This is another one where they were looking at examiner reliability and accuracy. So here they had 15 different trials. The blue ones were trials where they truly came from the same source, and the orange ones were trials where they truly came from different sources. And the 3 columns in each block are the 3 possible decisions, ID, exclusion, or inconclusive. And again, just look at I don't expect you to look at every piece of data, but just look at the shape of the data. Look at the fact that we have almost even voting in some of these, and we don't have unanimity in any of them. So that's, again, just the range of variability. So what can we do about this? Can we write some rules to make everybody do things the same way? Because that would be really good. We're trying to. We have this organization that is sort of jointly run by NIJ and NIST. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and NIJ is the National Institute of Justice. So they made this group called the OSAC, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, and their job is to write standards and guidelines and then send them through a standards development organization and get them published. This is just their organizational structure. So you can see that they've broken it into sort of 5 main categories, and each category has different subdisciplines within it. This is the website if you want to go and find out more about them. But the thing is, even though we're writing all of these standards, so I say we because I'm part of OSAC, but we're writing all of these standards and we're publishing them, they're still largely voluntary. We don't have any sort of enforcement mechanism Different laboratories across the country are not required to use these standards, and many of them don't. It comes down to documentation. There's going to be variability because people see things differently. And people have different comfort levels for their thresholds of how much is enough for them. How much do they think they need to support this conclusion to feel confident presenting it in court? But at the very least, we need to have documentation so that at least it's transparent what we did. So that if I'm a state expert making a call and the defense wants to hire a defense expert to review my work, that defense expert should be able to look and see exactly what it was that I thought supported my decision. What was the information I relied upon? And then they can assess whether they think that that information was reliable or not. And we can have a dialogue about that. But if I don't write anything down, if all I write is my conclusion was this print belongs to this guy, then it becomes much more difficult to have a rational conversation about what supported my decision. So this is something we're very much fighting for in the field right now, is to encourage people to document more, to at the very least show what they compared, what their results were, and what data they relied upon to reach those results. We want agencies to have written standard operating procedures. Many of them do, but many of them don't, which is really shocking. You can go into some major cities in this country and go into their crime lab and ask where their standard operating procedures are, and they just have an understanding. There's nothing written down anywhere. A lot of them don't have written training manuals. We have no way to track what sort of training people have received and whether it's sufficient or not. So that's all I'm going to say on that first question, the how much is enough. I'm going to turn to the second question, which is much shorter, which is how sure are you? What are our certainties in our results? So we've come up with this result, we've put it in a report, we're presenting it in court, but how do we know we're right? Or do we think we're right? So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes here on the notion of certainty, because it's something we use a lot in the world, and fingerprint examiners are really not any different than regular people when it comes to being certain about decisions. So often in court, you will hear people say things like, well, is this an ID to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? So it's a phrase that we're often asked to use. This one I blame on the lawyers. The lawyers came up with this phrase and they love it and they want us to say it, and it doesn't mean anything. No scientist would say this in the course of regular science. Oh, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. That doesn't mean anything. It's bolstering. It's words that make it sound like we really know what we're doing to impress the jury, but there's nothing behind it. There's no calculations. There's no confidence intervals. None of that's been done. We're just trying to make it sound like our conclusion is super sciencey. So the other thing that we tend to say, again, usually at the prompting of an attorney, but we often said that we were 100% certain in our conclusions. We would be asked, what was your conclusion? Well, I identified it to the defendant. And how certain are you of that? Are you 100% certain? Because, of course, if you say you're not 100% certain, then the jury's going to hear, oh, well, then it might not be him because the expert isn't sure. Right? So the expert would claim to be 100% certain, which is a ridiculous thing to say as a scientist. In science, we're never 100% certain of anything. I'm not 100% certain the sun will come up tomorrow. I like my odds, but I'm not 100% certain, right? So as scientists, we're supposed to be open to the notion that if we get new data, that may lead us to new conclusions. So when we make a conclusion or we make a decision, we're not reporting a fact. We're recording the best conclusion we can based on the data we observed. And that's how we should be presenting it in court. We should be giving those caveats instead of saying that we're 100% certain. Now, the reason that we say it, well, we were trained to say it. And we were trained to say it mostly because the agencies wanted us to be really sure. They didn't want us to go into court accusing somebody of a crime, essentially, if we weren't pretty darn sure. But pretty darn sure is not the same as 100% certain. And again, we haven't done any math. We haven't done any statistics to calculate a certainty. We're just using it in the colloquial sense of, yeah, I'm sure. But that's not necessarily what the jury hears. So we need to be careful about that. So if we say that we're not 100% certain, then a reasonable follow-up question would be, well, how certain are you? And theoretically, if we had models that could get to give us some sort of useful statistics about how often features were repeated, we would be able to give that certainty. We'd be able to calculate a mathematical uncertainty. But we don't have those models in fingerprints. They've been trying to do it for a long time. They haven't had a lot of luck. So we don't have a mathematical certainty to present. So the best we can do is express a probability based on the strength of our belief, which is basically what's known as a subjective probability. And subjective probabilities are okay as long as you make it clear that it is a subjective probability and also make it clear what you're basing that on. And it's a very personal thing. Everybody has their belief in the uncertainty of a proposition. We can't know everybody's certainty levels. So, talking about uncertainty as a concept for a minute, there are lots of things that humans are uncertain about, right? We're uncertain about the future. Sometimes we're uncertain about the past or uncertain about the present. And certainty should be dealing with what we know to be true and what we know to be false. But it really isn't. It's really dealing with what we're not sure about, because we're not sure about a lot of things. And what I'm unsure about could be different from what you're unsure about, and vice versa, because we have different experiences and we know different things. So there's a statistician, well-known statistician who does a lot in forensic science, known as Dennis Lindley, and he's written a whole book on uncertainty in forensic science. And he gives some of these examples just to see where uncertainty lies. So we could talk about something like it will rain tomorrow. Well, the degree of uncertainty around that statement could be changed by additional information or removed by time. We could just wait and see if it rains, and then we won't be uncertain anymore. But definitions become important. What do we consider rain? Does it have to be like a full downpour, or is a couple drops qualify as rain? What do we mean by tomorrow? Do we mean anytime tomorrow? Do we mean between noon and 1 tomorrow? Do we mean all day long tomorrow? So we start getting into these nuances of what is it exactly that we're being uncertain about. We can have a statement of the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. Well, that's going to be personal uncertainty. Some of us may be certain about that, and some of us may not. But that's the kind of uncertainty that can be removed by going to a reference that knows. What if our statement of uncertainty is the defendant is guilty? And we mean guilty in the sense of ground truth, guilty in the sense of he actually did it, not guilty in the sense of a verdict, because we know that verdicts aren't always correct, right? Sometimes people are falsely convicted. The idea of a trial is meant to reduce this uncertainty to the degree possible, but it can't remove it entirely. We can never be 100% certain of the guilt or innocence of somebody unless we were there witnessing the crime, and we weren't. There's some others here that are just kind of fun. Some saying a card drawn at random from a shuffled deck will be an ace. Well, this is an uncertainty that's been measured, right? We have the odds on that happening, and most people pretty much agree with what those odds are. In a deck of 52 cards, we know how often an ace should come up. But it still turns out to be kind of personal because if you look at the way people behave when they're gambling, they don't just rely on frequentist probabilities. They have luck, they have superstitions, they have all these little rituals that they believe will make that ace more likely to come up for them. If you look at something like horse racing or the stock market, these have explicit odds listed, but those still aren't actually representing the bookmaker's uncertainty. That's just what the bookmaker hopes he can make money off of. Or we could say, well, what about the uncertainty around the proportion of HIV cases in the population exceeds 10%? Well, there is uncertainty associated with that statement, even though it's a single number, not everyone in the community has been tested. So we're taking a sample and we're giving information on that sample, but there's still some uncertainty associated with that claim. So with all of this uncertainty, how do we cope? How do we make decisions if we can never be sure? Well, we have to take our personal probability of something occurring, and then we're going to combine that with what's known as utility, utility for the possible outcomes. And utility is a way of measuring the potential benefits and penalties of each possible outcome, viewed from the lens of your own preference. So if I'm trying to decide whether I'm going to make an identification while I'm looking at two fingerprints that aren't particularly clear, on some level, I'm looking at the data and I'm saying how much is here that supports that this could be an identification. But at some point, and possibly subconsciously, but on some level, I'm also doing a quick cost benefit analysis for myself. I'm thinking, okay, if I call this an ID and I'm right, what possible benefits could there be? Well, bad guy goes to prison. I get a pat on the back from my boss. Everybody thinks I'm cool, right? But what are the possible bad outcomes if I'm wrong? Well, we could put the wrong person in prison. They could find out I made a mistake. I might get fired. I'll be embarrassed in front of all of my coworkers, right? So you're looking at the data, but you're also putting your personal lens onto it as what's the utility of making this decision? So your belief in the event leads to your probability, but your preference for the event adds leads to your utility. And those utilities can come from lots of places. They can be your personal value system, they can be your agency's value system, they could be a cultural value system. All those things are going to weigh into what you think are the potential benefits or harms that could come from a decision. Okay, so once you do all that, you assess your risk tolerance. Am I willing to take the risk of making this call or not? And people have different risk tolerances too. Some people are very risk averse, some people are very comfortable with risks. And all of that rolled up together, that's the field of decision making, which is a whole separate field outside of any kind of forensic science. But it turns out that human beings are pretty good at it. We go through our life every day doing this calculus without necessarily stopping to consciously think about it, but we're taking action based on this calculus. We think about these things in a split second in the back of our mind, we make a decision and we act on that decision. So things like, should you get in a plane or in a car? Should you buy insurance? Should you buy a house or a car? These are all high risk decisions that we make pretty quickly. Should I take a new job? Should I go to a public place? Should I take part in a demonstration? Should I eat in a restaurant? How risky is that? Or eat a home cooked meal? How much time should I leave to get somewhere, especially in DC traffic? If I'm going to undergo a risky treatment for a deadly disease, what's my cost benefit analysis on that? Um, which production of Hamlet do I want to go to? Which one did I hear was good and want to spend my time at? Should I walk down a dark alley by myself? Should I pet a saber-toothed cat? These are all decisions that we make that help us survive and, continue on through evolution if we've done it well. So I'm going to leave you just a second with a couple last cartoons just on certainty. It wasn't an easy decision for me to make. Lots of coin tossing went into it. This is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek jab at fingerprint examination, right? We have to make this binary decision. Either the fingerprint belongs to a suspect or it doesn't. And hopefully we're not flipping a coin. Hopefully we have a lot more going into the decision than that. But if we're not documenting, if we don't have clear definitions and clear thresholds, it's very opaque to the jurors. And for all they know, we are flipping a coin. So I will leave you here with my email address and one last shot at certainty. Call me when you're 100% certain. Well, I wouldn't wait by the phone if I were you. We're never going to be 100% certain, everybody. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.
All right. Thank you so much. And we do have questions and comments from our participants here. One of them is Ben Radford out in New Mexico. He's a research fellow with the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and a deputy editor for Skeptical Inquirer magazine. He says, in regard to your comment about wanting the examiner to document how they reached their decision, he says many experts rely on hunches, experience, and heuristics, and therefore may not want to be 100% transparent about their analysis process. Doesn't mean they're wrong, of course, just that if forced to explain and justify their decisions, they may be reluctant or evasive. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we see that quite a lot. A lot of people are very hesitant to document, partly because they don't want to take the time or they think it's a nuisance, but partly because they don't want somebody, checking their work that closely. We get a lot of pushback on that, particularly from people who've been doing this for a long time and sort of feel like I'm an expert. Why are you questioning me now? That sort of thing. The documentation is incredibly helpful for the transparency, also for our own memories. Usually, when we go to court to testify on a case, it's a year or 2 years after we actually did the work. And we've been doing cases, multiple cases a day since then. We don't remember what we saw or what we did. So by having the documentation, it can refresh our own memory of how did we reach this conclusion. But the other problem, which I didn't really touch on in this talk, is that of bias. There's a lot of concerns about contextual and confirmation biases, and doing contemporaneous documentation helps with that as well because it makes you commit to what you saw at the time. Whereas if I haven't looked at this case in a year and now I'm going to court and somebody's asking me, well, what did you rely upon? I have no idea what I relied upon back then. I could go ahead and compare it again, but the second time I'm comparing it, I already know the answer, right? The quote unquote answer, because it's what I reported. So now I'm going back and I'm looking for features, but I'm working backwards logically. I'm working from the answer to the data instead of working from the data to the answer. And that can be fairly dangerous as well.
Mm. Bruce Barron's in Virginia says, I'm curious what the differences are between how human examiners get an answer and how fingerprint readers get an answer.
Yes, that's a good question. I don't have an amazing answer because I'm not super familiar with the fingerprint reader technology. I do know that they look at it differently than we do. They're building algorithms that are looking at sort of skeletons of the ridges. So they're taking these ridge paths and they're getting rid of all the characteristics of the ridge and really just looking straight at the path. And I don't know how their algorithms work exactly, but I know that it's a much simplified process compared to what we do as human examiners, or even what our computers do, because we use AFIS, which you guys have probably heard about on TV. That's the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. That's a database that we can search to identify fingerprints. And we have a human examiner who goes back and checks. The computer just goes through and generates a candidate list. But it has sort of more advanced algorithms than what you're using to like unlock your phone or something. They're using a lot more information and a lot more machine learning and stuff. And even so, they're just providing a ranked list of candidates, which the human then goes through to make a final determination. So the phones and the biometric scanners and readers and stuff, my understanding is that they can be spoofed because they are um, not quite as robust in the information that they're considering for their identification decisions.
Ben Radford and also Chip Denman in Maryland wonder about what role might AI play in fingerprint analysis.
Yeah, we're working on that and we're not sure yet. It's sort of in its infancy. We're definitely starting to incorporate AI into, again, the AFIS algorithms. They're always tweaking their algorithms and updating them every year, and they're doing a lot more, again, machine learning, neural networks, and things like that, where they're trying to, rather than focus just on the features, those places where the ridges end or split, they're trying to get some sort of algorithms that can look at the entire image and do sort of whole image processing to get a lot more information. But those are definitely not perfect yet. And with the limited research that we have done, looking into sort of whether the human or the computer does a better job, what we found is that the human working with the computer does better than either one of them alone. So right now we're looking at sort of a distributed cognition thing, which isn't to say that it might not be fully automated someday, but we're not there yet.
Mhm. I wonder how many examiners you would have per case, always at least two. Is there a process to escalate an ambiguous print to put it in front of the most examiners and perhaps the star examiners or whatever you would call the best in
Yeah.
the field?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. So unfortunately, the laboratory system nationwide is a bit of the wild, wild west, in the sense that each agency has their own jurisdiction, has their own policies, and has their own rules. So places like OSAC that I talked about, we try to write standards and we try to get people to follow them, but we can't make people follow them.
Mhm.
And so you get a really wide range of practices. The best practice and what OSAC recommends is that each examiner should, one examiner works the case, they reach all their conclusions, and then that should always be given to another examiner who then checks everything, checks every single decision that was made in the case before it goes out the door.
Mhm.
That doesn't always happen. Some agencies don't have any of their work checked. some agencies have only their identification decisions checked. So if you make an exclusion, nobody's checking to see if it was a good exclusion or not. If you're deciding something wasn't suitable to compare, nobody's checking to see if they agree with that.
Mhm.
At the other end of the spectrum, some places do what's called blind verifications, which means that if I work the case, I reach a decision and I want it to be verified, I then send off just the original images with no other information, and somebody else essentially works the case from scratch. And then we see if our conclusions agree. Whereas the verification that most labs do is what's known as open verification, where I reach my conclusion and then I hand my case file off to someone else to check it, but they know that it came from me. They know what my conclusion was. They can look at my notes and see all the features I picked. So then we're back again to that confirmation bias problem where they're being essentially tainted by all the work I already did from forming an independent opinion.
Mhm.
So you asked about ways to escalate it. It is possible to escalate, but usually that only occurs if there's been a disagreement. So if I say something and my verifier agrees with me, then we sign off on it and the report goes out the door. But if I say it's an ID, I hand it to my verifier and they say, no, I think you made a mistake, then we have to go into a conflict resolution process, which could be just resolved by the two of us talking it over and one of us saying, oh, okay, I see what you're saying now. And now we agree. But we may not agree, in which case then we would go to a third examiner or we would go to one of those blind verifications where the next person doesn't know what either one of us thought, or we might even go to a panel where several people weigh in on it and then there's a group discussion. So there's a lot of different levels of conflict resolution that can happen if that occurs.
See, yeah, Bruce Behrens had wondered about the um, blind checking. Well, why wouldn't that be the standard procedure rather than these disputed? Ideally, you wouldn't have the biases, the confirmation bias that you described. You'd avoid that using a blind checking, but it sounds like that isn't always done.
It's rarely done. There are only a few agencies that do it. And the reason is cost, really, at the end of the day. It's if you think about one person doing the work and a second person checking the work versus two people doing the work entirely, it's a lot more resource investment to have two people do the work entirely, which is essentially what a blind verification is. And so a lot of agencies say we can't afford to essentially double our caseload. We already have backlogs. It's already taking us months to get cases done. If we went to blind verifications, we'd fall even further behind. We don't have the funds to hire more people, all that sort of thing. And so we get into these arguments where the proponents of blind verification say, yeah, but it would be so much better, and you don't want to make a mistake. And the lab managers who don't want to spend more money essentially say, well, prove it.
Mhm.
There haven't been any structured scientific studies that have demonstrated that blind verification catches more errors than open verification does.
Mhm.
So the lab managers are kind of saying, look, this is a huge investment. If you want me to make this investment, you have to show me that it's going to be worth it. And
Mhm.
nobody has done that research yet. So even though philosophically it seems like a no-brainer, like obviously, checking the work without any kind of bias is going to be better, without any data showing for this investment, you're going to get this much benefit, a lot of lab managers just aren't willing to do it.
I see. It seems to me if in a dream world, we would bring in as many examiners as possible. Part of it, as I heard you say near the beginning of your talk, is training brains to correctly examine fingerprints to be able to see these minutia.
Mhm.
I'm wondering how long does it typically take for an individual to get good at that?
Yeah, so as with everything, there's a range. Some agencies take it more seriously than others. In the United States, the average training period is about 2 years.
Mhm.
There's some who do it in less, but in Australia, it's 5. So there's quite and so they look quite down on the U.S. for our shoddy training practices of only spending 2 years. But a lot of places think that 2 years seems like a really long time. But yeah, that's usually what it takes.
I wonder if there's a method to expedite the brain training process I'm sort of kidding here, where people would walk around all day with fingerprint designs in front of them. I'm
Yeah.
going too far, but the idea being getting people to be familiar with that. If I may, very quickly, looking at the surface of the moon in up close orbital images is something I've gotten some talent in, but looking at various shades of gray and shadows from different directions and so on.
Mhm.
I sort of related to that in terms of
Okay.
your fingerprint. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense.
reading.
I hadn't thought about that being analogous, but yeah, you're right. They often compare us to radiologists, interpreting shadows on X-rays and things. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's very, very similar.
My silly comment aside, is there a way perhaps to expedite that brain training process that hasn't been recognized yet?
I don't know. I mean, we've looked at a lot of psychological literature on sort of the science of learning, and we've tried to capitalize on some of those concepts, like the scaffolding and making things progressively more challenging, and giving timely feedback, and all these things that help people learn better.
Mhm.
But when it comes to just training the visual system, it seems like you just have to put in the time staring at images. The way our training program works is usually the first couple months you're just looking at fingerprints all day long and you're not comparing yet. They're just giving you latents and you spend the first couple weeks just looking at them and not even really saying anything about them. And then they build you up to starting to make those value decisions where you're looking at it and you're taking them back to your trainer and saying, okay, this one I would compare, this one I wouldn't. And you talk about why, like how many features could you find? What did you think the clarity was? And so we just sort of build up slowly. And so you could spend the first few months looking at literally thousands of fingerprints before you even start to compare. And then you spend months, on easy comparisons and then moving to sort of mid-level comparisons. And then you start learning how to interpret distortion. So by the time you're done with your 2 years of training, you've looked at hundreds of thousands of fingerprints. But
Mhm.
I don't know how you would necessarily expedite it. I mean, it's a great question, but I don't have an answer.
Maybe Google glasses or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Maybe if you could
Melissa,
like have images put in while you're sleeping.
right? Melissa in Virginia says crime solving has been increasingly reliant on DNA technology, where advancements seem never ending.
Mhm.
Is fingerprint analysis becoming obsolete?
It's not. They're both still used. Fingerprints are still preferred in many ways because they're faster and cheaper.
Mhm.
So DNA is sort of, the gold standard as far as identification goes. But the labs have backlogs more than a year long. It's expensive to run it. A lot of labs put limits on what they even will run for DNA. So when I worked for the Oregon State Police, we were a whole statewide system with 8 labs throughout the state, but only one of those labs actually did DNA. And they were so backlogged for the state's cases that they said things like, we will only take DNA from violent crimes. We won't take it from property crimes.
Yeah.
We'll only take 2 samples per case. So you've got to choose what you think your most probative surfaces are. We won't do touch DNA at all. So they have all these rules about what they'll even accept because they just can't keep up with the volume.
Mhm.
Whereas fingerprints also has a backlog, but it's usually shorter. And you can usually get both kinds of evidence. So I don't think fingerprints are going away anytime soon.
I see. Listen, I'm obviously not a defense attorney, but I imagine they must love this type of information that you provided today.
Mhm.
Um, wouldn't they be able to use this analysis that you described to get fingerprint evaluations thrown out of court? All the uncertainties, and then
Yeah. Yeah.
you're asserting things with scientific language, that goes beyond the true scientific limit.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely, some of them are trying. There have been quite a few challenges in court, mostly unsuccessful because it's so deeply ingrained in the legal system to trust fingerprints. It's really hard to get a judge to even consider a different viewpoint. I do actually a lot of consulting work and training for the defense community. I am a fingerprint examiner, but I'm also a reformer. Like, I very much want to see us get better. And I feel
Mhm.
like we won't get better unless we're challenged. So I've been sort of trying to help the defense community mounting some of these challenges, to sort of illuminate the points of weakness so that we are forced to improve them because we can be better. But first, we have to acknowledge that, there's a problem. Kind of have to get on our 12-step program here.
Good.
And admit that there are places where we're not infallible and we're not perfect and we are human. And it's not to say that fingerprinting isn't good and that it's not useful. I think it's very good and very useful, but I
Mhm.
think we need to be a lot more transparent about the limitations, and we need to make claims that are a lot more defensible. Walking into anything and saying I'm 100% certain and my methodology has a zero error rate is ridiculous. So we
Mhm.
need to be, couching it in more realistic terms.
It seems to me like in the big picture that having a DNA analysis and like high resolution video or something like that
Mhm.
can really put fingerprints to the test, where it's like, hey, the fingerprint says it's not so and so, but the video and or DNA, it's like that's definitely that person. And then it's like, oh, fingerprints fumbled that didn't work here. Isn't that possible? And just in very general terms, that things that really are essentially infallible, uh, can be used as sort of a partner to keep fingerprint analysis under scrutiny or.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it should be under scrutiny, but I would push back a little bit on a couple of those statements because fingerprints, well, DNA, first of all, DNA is not as infallible as people think either.
Ah,
And it's got its own host of problems. And ironically, a lot of DNA's problems come from it being too good. And ties into the fingerprint thing too. Just because we say that this fingerprint belongs to that person, we're not necessarily opining on how that fingerprint got there or when that fingerprint got there. So
mhm,
just because you find somebody's fingerprint in a place, you still have to prove that it somehow links them to the crime.
mhm,
We've had cases where, somebody's fingerprint was found on a window and he was arrested for a rape, and turns out that he worked in the window manufacturing company, and his fingers were there because he helped make the window.
mhm,
So things like that, just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean the person's guilty.
mhm,
That's a separate proposition. But the problems that DNA is having is because the technology has gotten so good and so sensitive. You used to need to have a pool of blood to get a full DNA profile. Now you can get it from like a cell or like a 3 cells or something. Because it's so sensitive and because DNA travels so well, it's in our saliva when we spitting when we talk. It's in the air. It's everywhere. The problem they're having right now is that they're starting to identify people's DNA at scenes, when the people were never at that scene. We're talking about secondary and tertiary transfer and things. There's a really well-known case where a man was arrested for a murder, that he claimed he didn't do, and he had an airtight alibi. He had been in the hospital because he was dead, passed out, drunk, and they were trying to revive him at the hospital at the time of the murder.
mhm,
Well, they had his DNA, on stuff from the scene. It turns out that the same ambulance who picked him up when he passed out drunk then went back late on a later night call and picked up the dead guy. And there was DNA from him in the ambulance that got transferred onto the dead guy's body. So then when they swab the guy, they find this other man's DNA, and he had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. He just shared an ambulance. So, I mean, the fact that somebody who was never even there, his DNA can end up there, makes the interpretation of low amounts of DNA or mixtures of DNA very tricky.
mhm. Listen, I realize we're winding down here into the 90-minute range, but I did want to ask you, I assume that false negatives are more common than false positives.
Yes.
Is that right? Where,
Many times more common, yeah.
yeah, and that makes sense in terms of it would be very hard to mistake someone in particular, rather than, um, saying that that can't be that person, and in fact it is. I guess realize this is outside the scope of your discussion here, but I wanted to run this past you in terms of if someday, let's say the United States had a database of every person's fingerprints. I wonder if false positives would happen more frequently, whereas like we don't understand
Yeah.
how frequently a fingerprint could match someone else.
Yep. Yep. No,
Uh,
absolutely, it could. The larger the database, the greater the risk of what we call a coincidental match, where you've just found something, or a close non-match, which is a print that is truly from another person but looks so close that it's really easy to get them mixed up.
mhm,
And yeah, you get bigger and bigger databases, that chance absolutely increases.
mhm. Yeah, obviously, faces aren't fingerprints, but I've seen, hundreds or thousands of faces,
Mhm.
walking in malls, sporting events, on television. And it's like, wow, that person's face looks a lot like mine.
Uh-huh.
This particular guy who used to pitch for the Baltimore Orioles, Major League Baseball team, several years ago. And so it's like, I don't know if fingerprints, another complex biological form,
Yeah,
it could also have that same type of thing. But I have seen faces, and so anyway, I wonder. I'm not saying that this pitcher has the same fingerprints as I do, but generally the idea that you could have maybe a true match, at least within the threshold of your evaluation capability. It's
exactly. Yeah. It's what we
on the
call
other hand,
discernible uniqueness. It's that they may actually be different,
yes.
but not at a level that we're able to distinguish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Eldridge, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I passed along to you the questions, but the compliments here in this chat window, that they're numerous as well.
Well, thank you very
Uh,
much.
and it's such a uh, consequential talk. Nothing against the Bigfoot hunters or Loch Ness Monster, but this is far more consequential.
Mhm.
The fate of you know someone perhaps being unjustly convicted or unjustly acquitted,
Yes.
and harming others. Um, so thank you so much for opening this door to us,
Of course.
skeptics on this topic. I
Oh,
also
I'm
wanted to
happy to be here.
thank Yes. I also wanted to thank our producer as always, JD Mack. Fantastic job as always. And want to thank our participants today. And we hope you'll join us next time. Don't know exactly when, but stay tuned. And, we'll get together again to discuss an interesting topic like this. Thanks again. Have a good night.
Good night.
All right, JD, I guess, are we isolated?